once, think twice, think bike.
Welcome to episode 54 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are plunging into the world of ecological horror, with two films which suggest that, unless we learn to live more harmoniously with the planet, we will suffer the consequences. First up, we have The Day the Earth Caught Fire from 1961. This was directed by Val Guest and stars Edward Judd, Janet Monroe, Leo McKern, Michael Goodliffe and Bernard Braden. And then we follow this with our first Australian movie on the podcast, which is Long Weekend from 1978. This was written by Everett De Roche, directed by Colin Eggleston, and stars Peter Hargreaves and Briony Behets. Along the way, we'll be discussing the career of writer-director Val Guest, Australian censorship of horror in the last half of the 20th century, the birth of the Australian horror movement, the career of screenwriter Everett De Roche, and much, much more. But before we do any of that though, as always, I'd just like to mention the main sources that I've used in researching this week's episode, and of course all sources will be listed or linked in the show notes. So when discussing The Day the Earth Caught Fire, I have referred to the book British Science Fiction Cinema, edited by IQ Hunter, interviews and special features on the Blu-ray release of the film from the British Film Institute, and interviews and articles on the websites theguardian.com, historyproject.org.uk, ajb007.co.uk, bfi.org.uk, and nzpetesmatchshot.blogspot.com. And when discussing Long Weekend, I have referred heavily to the book Australian Horror Films 1973 to 2010 by Peter Shelley, Australian Gothic, A Cinema of Horrors by Jonathan Rayner, interviews and special features on the Blu-ray release of the film from Second Sight Films, and interviews and articles from the National Archives of Australia and the websites censorsofcinema.com, cinemaaustralia.com.au, cineexcess.co.uk and littlewhitelies.com. And as usual, I've also referred to the IMDb and Wikipedia pages, and also this week the Australian Film Institute pages for the movie's cast and crew. Screenwriter and director Val Guest is probably best known to some for his work with British studio Hammer, for whom he directed 14 movies. These include The Quatermass Experiment in 1955 and its follow-up, Quatermass 2, in 1957, as well as cryptid horror The Abominable Snowman, also in 1957, and their dinosaur fantasy When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth, released in 1970. But outside of Hammer Studios, he was also an incredibly prolific writer and director, with a career spanning nearly 50 years and encompassing genres that include comedy, musicals and drama. He was born in Maida Vale in London on December 11th, 1911, and was named Valmont Morris Grossman, a name that he later changed to the one with which we are now more familiar. His father was a broker for a fibre called jute, one of the strongest and most sustainable natural fibres in the world, and second only to cotton in global production. As a result, Guest spent much of his infancy in India, before returning to England shortly before the outbreak of World War I. His parents divorced while he was still very young, and his father obtained custody, telling him that his mother had died, something that he believed for many years. Guest later learned the truth from his grandparents, but even then led his father to believe that he still believed the story, keeping later meetings with his mother completely secret. He was educated at Seaford College in Sussex, and later recalled that what he most remembered from this time was sneaking down from the dormitory very early in the morning to the master's common room, where there was an old typewriter, on which he slowly learned to type, initially with 2 fingers, and began to write what he called odd stories. This interest was very much encouraged by his mother on the odd occasions that he saw her, and she also paid the first instalment on a typewriter to encourage him in his creative endeavours. His mother had been an actress and also wrote poetry, and it's apparent that Guest's creative interest came from her side of the family, with his father preferring him to go into something far more conventional like bookmaking. To be fair to his father, though, he did pay for piano lessons when Guest was a child, though he forbade any playing after 7 p.m. or for more than 15 minutes at a time. When his father remarried, Guest announced that he wanted to move into the creative arts, and in his early teens he began writing for newspapers, including the film page for a publication called The Sphere, and articles for other publications, including the Illustrated London News and Film Weekly. From here he moved into acting and began to appear in touring stage productions, much to the disappointment of his father, who once told him, quote, "It is the duty of all respectable people to keep their names out of the newspaper," end quote. In 1931, he met the British-American actress and director Ida Lupino, who introduced him to her brother, a man called Lupino Lane, who was, at the time, preparing a musical film called Maid of the Mountains. Lane offered Guest the opportunity to help write some of the screenplay, though he received no actual film credit, but he was also offered a bit part which would lead to further small film roles. He also began a songwriting partnership with a fellow performer called Ivan Keith, an occupation that Guest augmented with freelance writing work. By 1935, he was working as the London correspondent for the newly launched London edition of The Hollywood Reporter, where he reviewed a film by a director called Marcel Varnell. As Guest later put it, quote, "In the brashness of youth, I said if I couldn't write a better film than this with one hand tied behind my back, I'd give up the business." And Marcel got in touch with Billy Wilkerson, who edited and published The Hollywood Reporter, and said, "If your reporter is so good and clever, let him write my next." It was a challenge. I said to Billy Wilkerson, "I can't, it's silly." He said, "You made up the challenge and you're going to make the paper look stupid. So you go and take up the challenge or you don't have a job here anyway." End quote. Fortunately, Marcel Varnell, who Guest described as an excitable little Frenchman, had not thrown down the gauntlet out of anger or grievance. He'd been reading Guest's columns with interest, and he knew that he could write. And thus began a partnership between the two that ran from 1935 to 1942, with an unwritten agreement that Guest couldn't write anything that Varnell didn't direct, and that Varnell couldn't direct anything that Guest didn't write. Their first film together was called No Monkey Business, released in 1935, followed by a musical called Public Nuisance No. 1. Guest would later say that it was through Varnell that he truly learned his trade, saying that he did more than just write every picture. He also did odd second unit shots that he was occasionally allowed to film. It was with Varnell that Guest began working at a British studio called Gainsborough, where he co-wrote screenplays and also did occasional second unit directing. These included several films starring the British comedy actor Will Hay, including Oh Mr. Porter and Good Morning Boys in 1937, Ask a Policeman in 1939, and The Ghost of St. Michael's in 1941. Apparently, Will Hay was so impressed with Guest's writing and his second unit direction that he gave him the director's chair that Guest used for the rest of his career. At around the same time, Guest also co-wrote the screenplay for a wartime propaganda film called The Ghost Train, which was released in 1941, which starred British music hall performer Arthur Askey, who would also go on to star in Guest's first feature as a director. This was a film called Miss London Limited, released in 1943. Guest followed this with a run of British movies, working across multiple genres and developing a reputation as a disciplined and versatile craftsman who could turn his hand to comedy, musical, drama, and in 1955, science fiction. This was the Quatermass Experiment, a movie I've discussed many times now over the course of this podcast without actually ever covering it fully, although by this point I'm not sure I have that much more to say. As we know, it was this movie which saw Hammer shift from low-budget B-movies into the world of science fiction and then ultimately horror. It was based on a Nigel Kneale BBC series and was initially written by an American called Richard Landau, though Guest would later extensively revise the screenplay. Guest also took the director's chair, but, as he wasn't really a fan of science fiction, was initially unenthusiastic about the project. However, he did rather reluctantly take copies of Nigel Kneale's TV scripts with him away on holiday, although he had to be persuaded to read them by his then wife. Impressed by what he eventually read, and happy to be offered an opportunity to break away from directing comedy movies, he took on the assignment, deciding that he wanted to make a wild story more believable by shooting it in a style which he called, quote-unquote, science fact. Taking this documentary-style approach, in a later interview, he said that his plan had been, quote, to shoot it as though a television company had said, go out and cover this story. I wanted it to look as though it was being filmed by handheld cameras. We didn't have to frame somebody absolutely in the middle. I wanted to make it real, end quote. Although this style rather horrified the technicians working on the movie, who also found his meticulous storyboards far too mechanical, it is in fact one of the reasons why the film was so successful and why it remains such an effective piece of filmmaking even today. On its release, the Manchester Guardian praised the, quote, narrative style that quite neatly combines the horrific and the factual, end quote, while the Times singled out the direction in particular, saying, quote, Mr. Val Guest, the director, certainly knows his business when it comes to providing the more horrific brand of thrills, end quote. Guest employed the very same approach with the follow-up Quatermass 2, released in 1957, adding his own rewrites to the screenplay created by original writer Nigel Kneale and taking a similar documentary style. Though admittedly not as successful as its predecessor and receiving rather mixed reviews, the Times was once again very complimentary, saying, quote, the writer of the original story, Mr. Nigel Kneale, and the director, Mr. Val Guest, between them keep things moving at the right speed and without digressions. The film has an air of respect for the issues touched on, and this impression is confirmed by the acting generally, end quote. In the same year, once again for Hammer, Guest and Kneale produced The Abominable Snowman, a film we'll be covering later in the series, before the director moved on to co-write and direct another Hammer production, 1958's The Camp on Blood Island. Away from Hammer, he returned to comedy with Up the Creek, released in 1958, and its follow-up, Further Up the Creek, as well as a wartime drama called Yesterday's Enemy, and a musical drama called Espresso Bongo, both of which were released in 1959. But even while all this was happening, Guest had been developing a new story, one that would become his masterpiece and combine his science fact approach to direction with what was possibly the single biggest societal fear of the time, the threat of the atomic bomb. All of which brings us on to our first film of the week, which is The Day the Earth Caught Fire from 1961. This was written and directed by Val Guest and stars Edward Judd, Janet Monroe, Leo McKern, Michael Goodliffe, and Bernard Braden. And now we are getting into the spoilers. So, as usual, if you have yet to see The Day the Earth Caught Fire, now's the time to press pause and come back once you have. On October the 3rd, 1952, Britain conducted its first atomic bomb test, codenamed Operation Hurricane. A 25-kiloton plutonium device was detonated aboard a Royal Navy frigate moored off the coast of Western Australia, and its success made the United Kingdom the world's third nuclear power, following the United States and the Soviet Union. At the time, the public largely accepted the government narrative that nuclear weapons were a defensive necessity, and the media framed the device not as a tool of mass destruction, but as a vital deterrent that would preserve global peace and protect Great Britain from Soviet aggression. In the period following World War II, in which the country was enduring economic austerity, food rationing, and a noticeable decline in its global empire, the test was hailed by the press and the public as a major triumph, definitive proof that Britain remained a global superpower capable of matching the achievements of both the USA and the USSR. But not everyone was convinced, and voices of dissent began to appear in the letters pages of the national newspapers. Dissent that prompted Guest to begin writing this week's film. He was inspired, he said, quote, by all these people writing to the Times and saying how all these atomic tests were changing the atmosphere and the weather, and other people were saying, what absolute rubbish. But I suddenly thought, what if these tests did do that? What would happen then? End quote. The threat of the atomic bomb, ever present since the explosions on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, would give rise to any number of science fiction and horror movies, including The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms in 1953, 1954's Godzilla from Japan, and Them, a giant ant movie from the USA, released in the same year. But Guest's concept and story was far more serious. A bleak and apocalyptic 20-page treatment, which, as it turned out, was a pretty hard sell to financiers. As he later put it, quote, I got the idea 8 years before I made it. It wasn't that I didn't want to do it, but in every one of those years, I made a film that was successful, and someone would say to me, what do you want to do next? When I told them about the day the Earth caught fire, they said, you must be mad. Who wants to know about bombs and things? No. Get on with the things you know how to do. And I did that for 8 years. But in the 8th year, I thought, I'm going to make this sink or swim. End quote. The central premise of the story, which is told in flashback, is that simultaneous nuclear tests conducted by the USA and USSR have given the world, as one character puts it, the biggest jolt since the Ice Age. This jolt has tilted the planet by 11 degrees and also knocked it out of orbit, sending the Earth on a slow but inevitable trajectory closer to the Sun. A rather overblown premise, one might first assume, but the brilliance of Guest's story and his direction is to ground that premise in everyday reality, building on his science fact approach to filmmaking while also drawing on his years of working as a journalist. Unlike many science fiction movies of the time, and indeed many of those that followed, the film isn't centered around heroic pilots, earnest scientists, and government officials trying to save the day. It focuses instead on the impact of the disaster on regular people, well, journalists at least, as they firstly try to work out what the hell is going on, and then wonder exactly how the authorities are going to try to help them. While the cause of the catastrophe might stretch the realms of plausibility if looked at hard enough, the consequences, given the extent of present-day climate change, seem like apt prophecy. This puts the day the Earth caught fire in the same space as other climate change scenarios like 2004's The Day After Tomorrow, though I would argue that here the catastrophe is presented through a far more realistic lens. After all, no one is running frantically to escape menacing permafrost in this film. In a later interview, Guest explained the political subtext of his story, which was not an argument for the left or the right, but one that sided with humanity itself, saying, quote, the only politics in it were to say that the only war that mankind couldn't fight was God, was the elements, and the only way to defeat that was if mankind got together to fight that common enemy. That was what we've done to the elements, the atomic bombs. It was saying mankind can do this, so why doesn't mankind get together and see some sense? End quote. A very good question, and one that many of us are still asking 60 years later. But given the central concept of the film, one can see why so many studios had a hard time with it. It is, after all, quite a far cry from giant ants and giant lizards, and it's also relentlessly bleak. Eventually, though, one producer saw the opportunity. This was a man called Stephen Palos, who, with fellow producers Michael Balkan and Max Seton, created a production company called Pax Films and began to put funding together. Guest also put up his profits from the musical Espresso Bongo as collateral. all of which led film production company British Lion, who had originally turned the project down, to eventually invest. Guest completed the screenplay with a writer called Wolf Mankiewicz, with whom he had worked on Espresso Bongo, and after 8 years of trying to get his story made, The Day the Earth Caught Fire finally went into pre-production. The Day the Earth Caught Fire begins not in black and white, but in burning tones of orange and yellow, as, anticipating the opening of 28 Days Later by nearly 40 years, the camera pans across a deserted city of London and a dried-out River Thames. Unlike Danny Boyle's Apocalypse, though, much of this is achieved through matte paintings and composite techniques courtesy of Les Bowie, often considered the pioneer of UK special effects work. Bowie was supported by matte artist Roy Capel, who had provided uncredited special effects on the Quatermass experiment, and who would go on to work on films including Alien, Brazil, Highlander, and Tim Burton's 1989 version of Batman. There's no theme music, save for an ominous sustained hum in the background, and very little sound, except an announcement from a police car moving slowly through the deserted streets around Piccadilly Circus. 10:41, 19 minutes before countdown. 19 minutes. However, despite the extensive use of matte paintings, some of the abandoned city was filmed as live, and this was in the scenes involving parts of Fleet Street, which, to viewers outside of the UK, is, or was at the time, the home of most of the national newspapers. It is this street from which one can see St Paul's Cathedral in the background, and filming here was achieved not by shooting early morning like Danny Boyle, but by filming midweek and in the middle of the day. According to Val Guest, the authorities allowed them to clear the street for just 2 minutes at a time. Quote, "What we would do is we would have a truck full of fuller's earth and dirt and rubble. When we were ready to go, and our actors had rehearsed, we'd say, right, ready, and the truck with fuller's earth would go up Fleet Street with all the props shoveling fuller's earth all over, so that there was dust all over the street. And as the truck went up, 2 motorcycle cops followed, one on each side of the road, and then a whistle went, and I had 2 minutes of no traffic to do my scene, and then another whistle would go, and all the traffic would come again." End quote. It is down this street that we first meet our protagonist, Pete Stenning, sweating profusely as he walks slowly into view, although this particular shot is once again achieved through the effects work of Bowie and Capel. And though we do not yet know his character's name, as he appears, the credit announces the actor playing him, a bold orange text that says quite simply, "Introducing Edward Judd." Up to this point, Edward Judd was an actor who had appeared largely in bit parts and uncredited film roles, but he had also done some work on television. It was through one of these TV parts that he first came to guest attention, and his casting in this film propelled him to mainstream success. But unfortunately, his career very much peaked with this film, though he did appear in several other movies across the 1960s and early 1970s. These include First Men in the Moon in 1964, sci-fi horror Island of Terror in 1966, the disappointing Hammer movie The Vengeance of She, released in 1968, and the Amicus anthology film The Vault of Horror in 1973. After this, he drifted somewhat into obscurity, appearing mainly on British TV through the 1970s, including a public information advert about road safety, which gave us the Easter egg at the opening of this week's episode. As to why his career never really took off, it would appear that he had only himself to blame. Following his starring role in this film, he was signed to a long-term contract with Columbia Pictures, but according to Val Guest, quote, "He was such a pain in the ass to everybody. He had an enormous opinion of himself and he was his own worst enemy. Columbia just loaned him out here and there, and then let him go." End quote. And this is a bit of a shame because his performance here is rather good, particularly in the earlier scenes when he arrives at his offices inebriated and very wisely chooses not to play a man being drunk, but a man trying to appear sober. Then again, perhaps another reason that his performance is so good is because Pete might have been close to his actual character, as Mr. Stenning is also, being blunt, a giant pain in the ass, for the first half of the film at least. But before we meet Drunk Pete, Obnoxious Pete, Lecherous Pete, and finally Heroic Pete, we meet him as the narrator of the movie, making his way to the offices of his newspaper, the Daily Express, a real-world publication whose office exterior and print rooms were used in the actual film. Meanwhile, the interiors of the Daily Express offices were meticulously replicated at Shepperton Studios, England, with the art director even taking photos of all the desks in the offices to replicate them on set. And this meticulous attention to detail also extends to the signage in the newsroom, which announces, quote, "Impact, get it in your first sentence, get it in your headlines, and in pictures most of all," end quote. Something that pretty much sums up the directing style of the entire movie. But the Daily Express also provided more than just the setting. Former Express editor Arthur Christensen acted as a technical consultant on the film. He also obtained film clearance with the owner of the Express newspapers and also appears as a version of himself in the role of editor Jeff Jefferson. And that's a name after Spider-Man if ever I've heard one. But whether this was wise casting or not is really down to the viewer, and according to guests, they were very much split down the middle on his inclusion. Quote, "Some people said it was a brilliant offbeat performance, and others said how fucking awful. We had terrible trouble with him. The poor guy couldn't remember a line. I wrote them everywhere for him, and we finally did it almost line by line. I didn't expect him to be in such terror, and he was. The first day he wasn't in terror, and we'd gone so far by then. He started to get that terror when he realised that he'd bitten off more than he could chew, and then it was too late." End quote. But, as always, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Back to the opening of the film. Pete makes his way to the newsroom and attempts to type his story, though with the typewriter ribbons disintegrating in the heat, he doesn't get very far. He calls down to the switchboard where we are introduced to Heroine Jeannie, appearing backlit in a semi-transparent dress as she wanders, dazed and exhausted, to answer his call. Jeannie is played by Janet Monroe, a British actress who had begun her career on BBC TV before moving on to roles in low-budget feature films, including 1958's The Trollenberg Terror, also known as The Crawling Eye. In the same year, she was cast as the female lead in Disney's Darby O'Gill and the Little People, and this led to a 5-year contract with Disney, during which she appeared in the films Third Man on the Mountain, released in 1959, and Swiss Family Robinson, released in 1960. Her contract with Disney ended early, something that Monroe said was very much her decision, but it appears more likely it was Disney's choice, as by that stage they had decided to make a star out of another British actress, Hayley Mills. Her choice or not, though, she was very keen to break away from the squeaky clean Disney image and move into more adult roles, an opportunity presented by this film, which she grabbed with both hands. As Guest later said, the role of Jeannie was a breakout one for her, allowing her to, quote, "be a genuine character and not just a sexless Disney virgin," end quote. Hence one imagines her backlit entrance, as well as a brief topless moment which was filmed twice. The first time in which she appears momentarily topless for countries with more progressive censorship laws, and then with her modesty covered by a towel for the American release. According to Guest on the Blu-ray commentary, Monroe found these scenes incredibly liberating, as when working for Disney, the wardrobe team had apparently bound her breasts down to create the illusion that she was still a child. However, Jeannie is far more than just eye candy, love interest, or damsel in distress. Though she does adopt these roles at one stage or another, she is also a very rounded character, knowing her own mind, independent, and rebuffing Pete's clumsy attempts at seduction. This is quite the rarity for science fiction movies of the time, and indeed many films of the period altogether. Admittedly, she does succumb eventually, giving us a romance subplot as well as the unnatural disaster, but at least she slaps him in the face, tells him not to act so desperate, and makes him sleep in the bathtub beforehand. Call transferred through to the copy desk, Pete begins to narrate his story, as the image swims before the camera and gradually shifts to more conventional black and white. Quote, "It is exactly 30 minutes since the corrective bombs were detonated. Within the next few hours, the world will know whether this is the end or another beginning, the rebirth of man or his final obituary. For the last time, man pursued his brother with a sword, and so the final fire was kindled. The earth that was to live forever was blasted by a great wind towards oblivion. It is strange to think that barely 90 days ago, ... End quote. It is a masterful and bleak opening, grabbing the attention much as directed by the signage in the press room, and from here on in the film barely lets up. In sharp contrast to the opening moments, we now see that it is raining heavily, hardly surprising for England, though we quickly learn that it has caused significant flooding. We also learn of earthquakes in Jakarta, transatlantic jets grounded due to navigation trouble, and also a riot at a beauty contest. But then again, this is, after all, a British tabloid. Among this noise, the news of atomic testing near the South Pole passes by almost unnoticed. But it is, as we later discover, partly the cause of the other news items, beauty pageant riot being the exception. Much of this information comes courtesy of a character called Bill Maguire, played by Leo McKern, an Australian-born actor who would find fame on British TV in the 70s in the series Rumpole of the Bailey, and who we first met just a few weeks ago when we discussed the Hammer movie X the Unknown. He is very much the wise older man of the press office, acting as a father figure to Pete, who even calls him Dad at one point, covering up his many foibles, and even writing copy under his name to keep him out of trouble with the boss. Later, Val Guest would recall that McKern, who he considered part of his personal film repertory company, was an incredibly natural actor and very real, and that he was also blessed with a photographic memory. Quote, "He would come in the morning and he could read the whole day's work just once and he knew it. And not only did he know his own lines, but he knew everyone else's, which infuriated some of them." End quote. It is Bill Maguire who largely pieces the narrative together, initially at least, realizing that the Russian bomb tests have happened at the same time as the American ones, and providing a very helpful deconstruction of what is happening for the benefit of his editor, his colleagues, and also the audience. Before that, though, he also sets up the political subtext of the movie, complaining about 17,000 protest letters, which sets the film very much in the days of Ban the Bomb. Although the first British bomb tests were greeted with support, on the whole, from the general public and the media, the campaign for nuclear disarmament, or CND, officially began in Britain on the 17th of February 1958. This was at a massive public launch meeting in Westminster, London, which drew an estimated 5,000 attendees. The movement quickly propelled itself into the public consciousness with its first protest march, beginning on Good Friday in April of the same year, which saw thousands walk from the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment at Aldermaston in Berkshire, England, to Trafalgar Square in London, where they attended a mass demonstration. And it is this very demonstration in Trafalgar Square that is shown in the movie, with actual newsreel footage intercut with additional scenes added in to build on Guest's documentary-style approach. Back to the main narrative, we now re-meet hero Pete Stenning, arriving at the office late and intoxicated. After being sent to the Met Office to research sunspots, barging his way into various offices like a bull in a china shop, and getting a slap in the face from Jeannie, Pete returns to the paper and then goes for a drink with Bill in Harry's Bar, a real-life pub just off Fleet Street, the interiors of which were used for filming. Once here, we learn that Harry's Bar clearly serves the fastest steaks cooked in the West, but more importantly, that Pete is going through a bitter divorce caused by his wife's infidelity, and that his young son Mike is caught in the crossfire. Rather than face the situation head-on, Pete has decided to face it through the bottom of a whiskey glass, something that is also clearly not a secret. His colleagues and his editor are clearly losing patience, and later Jeannie tells him that her colleagues at the London Met Office know all about it as well, quoting the office adage, "Dogs bark, cats meow, and Stenning drinks." Pete is very much a misanthropic character in the mould of many kitchen sink dramas of the time. In fact, a review in the Monthly Film Bulletin, when the movie was released, called him quote-unquote the angry young man of Fleet Street. And though he is eventually saved, either by the love of a good woman or by the knowledge that the world is probably ending, he does manage to get in a few bitter and pithy exchanges along the way. These include that people only care about the news when it becomes personal, and that they are only interested in knowing about the, quote, filthy, self-destructive force humanity carries around, rotting in its belly, when it's all too late, end quote. The good woman who saves him is, of course, Jeannie, who he first insults over the telephone when trying to be put through to the Met Office, and who rewards him when they meet in person with a sharp slap around the face. However, she gradually relents on their next meeting in Battersea Park, and by this stage, we've started to soften a little towards him as well, having seen him spend time with his estranged son Mike. Like Fleet Street and Harry's Bar, Battersea Park is one of the many real locations across London that was used for filming, and it's also where one of the early weather anomalies of the movie first appears on screen. This is a bank of heat mist that rises from the Thames and blankets the city, and indeed, as we later discover, the majority of Europe. And it was achieved initially through the use of fog machines, all of which were used without the prior approval of the authorities. That's probably bad enough, but filming also took place on the same day as the opening of the Chelsea Flower Show, located just across the river over Chelsea Bridge. As Guest would later describe it, quote, "So of course the police were sent because of the Chelsea Flower Show, and I still had one more tracking shot and one very important shot to do in the fog. So the police were there saying, 'Stop, this must stop immediately.' So I sent my assistant, my production manager, and my location managers to talk to the police and to argue with the police just to keep them busy while we finished the shots. And eventually we did finish the shots, and they said, 'Take those out at once.' And so we did." End quote. Sadly, this instruction does mean that the fog emerging across the Thames had to be completed through special effects work, and the end results are far less than satisfactory, even for effects supervisor Les Bowie, who would later say, quote, "We did the scene with travelling mats, but the result had fringing around it and looks awful. So I wanted to do it again, but they said no, they couldn't afford the money." People commented on the shot when the film came out, though overall it was a very successful film and Val Guest did quite well out of it. But I wish I could have redone that awful scene. End quote. It certainly isn't great, but the other effects work, using matte work and superimpositions, such as the intense storms across London, are handled much better. The other natural disasters, including soaring temperatures, flooding, earthquakes and fires, are achieved through using archived newsreel footage to ensure that the film stayed within budget, while also adhering to Guest's cinema verite approach to the film. The mist is from the melting of the polar ice caps, caused by the Earth being knocked off its axis by the simultaneous bomb tests. Jeannie learns of this from her job at the Met Office and then reveals it to Peter, and he then dutifully prints it in the newspaper, despite his promises to do otherwise. This leads to her being temporarily arrested, but more significantly, the headline, "World Tips Over," is followed by rioting and public disorder, something that the Prime Minister of England tries to quell with a deliberately ludicrous, and these days actually rather realistic, address to the nation. Quote, "I felt it necessary to speak to you, if only to stop the many wild and irresponsible rumours precipitated by a general lack of facts. There has indeed been a displacement in the direction of the polar axis. But it is not a catastrophe, nor is it the millennium. Geologists and astronomers have had evidence that the tilt of the Earth has been altered more than once in the history of its evolution, and it has survived them all. What does this mean to us in our daily lives? Well, some of the seasons, as we know them, may be disturbed and change their intensity. This displacement has undoubtedly brought some regions nearer to the polar circle, while others have been carried further from it. But I have the utmost confidence that the world's scientists can produce solutions for any of the climatic problems we are likely to meet. I know that many of you are blaming the combined effects of nuclear tests for this disturbance of the motion of the Earth. I must tell you that the majority of the world's scientists deny that this is the cause. However, I would be failing in my duty if I did not admit to you that there are many others who believe it could have been. But whatever the rights or whatever the wrongs, the four major powers have now reached unconditional agreement to cancel further tests, experiments, manufacture, and work on nuclear projects. I ask you now to face the future calmly and constructively, remembering that here in Britain, at least, the weather is something we are used to coping with. End quote. Sound familiar, anyone? No wonder those listening, include Stenning and Bill, respond with, I wonder who writes his punchlines and what they'll do to get votes. The riots initiated by the news of the tilt to the Axis are, of course, but a drop in the ocean compared to the civil unrest that emerges later. These begin after the Russians announced to the world that, more than being tilted slightly in the wrong direction, the world is now heading towards the sun. Interestingly enough, this is also a premise that was used in another drama screened in 1961, a Twilight Zone episode written by Rod Serling called The Midnight Sun, which is regularly hailed as being one of the best in the series. Clearly, there was something in the water in the early 1960s. Meanwhile, in the world of our movie, water has gradually become a precious commodity, and life in the cities, as Pete has been warned by his editor, is becoming increasingly unpleasant. Water is heavily rationed, the governments set up public showering stations, and we soon learn of price gouging and water bandits on the highway. Worse still, black market water provision has resulted in a re-emergence of typhoid fever, suggesting that if nuclear accident doesn't kill everyone, then capitalism surely will. Society, as we understand it, is completely breaking down. By this point, we have established that world governments have decided the only course of action is to try to set the world to rights by detonating all thermonuclear bombs simultaneously 100 miles apart in the west of Siberia, an incredibly risky course of action that may save us all or may end the planet altogether. It comes as no comfort at all, despite the assertions of the Prime Minister, that this decision, quote, has been taken jointly by all governments and heads of state throughout the globe, acting in complete accord, end quote. A collaboration which, if nothing else, proves that this story is indeed a work of science fiction. We now come to what is, for me at least, the weakest point of the movie. Leaving the office to find Jeannie, Pete is warned by a very young Michael Caine in an early screen role to be careful on the streets of Chelsea, and not just because of the overpriced shops. Sure enough, when he arrives, he is mobbed in an unintentionally amusing scene, suggesting the worst that London has to offer in terms of rioters is a bunch of beatniks playing incredibly bad 1950s jazz. It's unfortunate, and as I say, it's also unintentionally laugh-inducing, coming as it does near the climax of what so far has been a very tense portrayal of society on its last legs. This then takes us full circle to the orange-yellow tinted beginning of the film, as Pete, Jeannie, Bill, and the management of Harry's bar wait out the countdown that will take mankind in one direction or another. And as the countdown sounds, we see more matte paintings of London, Moscow, Paris, and New York, all deserted and all in disarray. After the bombs go off, we return once more to Pete at his desk in the offices of the Daily Express, finishing his story, which acts as a statement for the world, and also as a statement about his personal journey through the course of the film. Quote, "So man has sown the wind and reaped the whirlwind. Perhaps in the next few hours there will be no remembrance of the past, and no hope for the future that might have been. All the works of man will be consumed in the great fire out of which he was created. But perhaps at the heart of the burning light into which he has thrust his world, there is a heart that cares more for him than he has ever cared for himself. And if there is a future for man, insensitive as he is, proud and defiant in his pursuit of power, let him resolve to live it lovingly, for he knows well how to do so. Then he may say once more, truly the light is sweet, and what a pleasant thing it is for the eyes to see the sun." End quote. As he speaks, the camera tracks through the print room of the Express newspaper, and we see 2 front pages waiting to hit the press, one with a message of doom and the other a message of salvation. We never discover which one will be printed, nor whether the church bells ringing as the movie closes sing for our victory or our demise. There are no end credits, just a fade to black. The Day the Earth Caught Fire opened in London in November 1961 and in the USA a few months later, in March 1962. In the UK, it was given an X certificate due to Monroe's partial nudity, which led Guest to suggest to John Trevelyan, the head of the BBFC, that censors must have dirty minds. To which Trevelyan replied, "Yes, well, we're paid to." Overall, reviews were very positive. Variety praised the direction, the performances, and the special effects work, while the Monthly Film Bulletin called it far more than just another piece of science fiction entertainment, going on to say that it was, quote, an important motion picture about the frightening fate awaiting mankind today, end quote. A financial success at the box office, it also earned Val Guest and co-writer Wolf Mankiewicz a BAFTA, and the director later referred to it as the favourite of all of his films. Val Guest continued to write and direct for another 24 years in pretty much any genre one can imagine. When asked about this in later interviews, he said he had been inspired to work in this way by advice given to him by the great Noel Coward, who told him that it was a mistake to, quote, ever come out of the same hole twice, end quote. And so, accordingly, his work encompasses pandemic movies, James Bond spoofs, disaster adventures, British sex comedies, and also Sherlock Holmes mysteries. His final directing credits were on a 1984 British TV series called The Hammer House of Mystery and Suspense, most of which were released as standalone episodes in the USA. His episodes, Mark of the Devil, Child's Play, and specifically one called In Possession, are the best of what was admittedly a hit-and-miss series, and if you get the opportunity, I suggest you check them out. In Possession, in particular, is magnificently creepy, and has some fantastic nightmare sequences which linger long after the final credits roll. He passed away from prostate cancer on the 10th of May 2006 in Palm Springs, California. He was 94 years old. All of which brings us on to our second film of the week, which is Long Weekend from 1978. This stars John Hargreaves and Briony Behets, was written by Everett De Roche, and was directed by Colin Eggleston. As I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, this is our first Australian movie of the series, but it certainly isn't going to be the last. Since the early 2000s, Australian horror has found increasing international critical and commercial success, including Wolf Creek in 2005, Lake Mungo in 2008, 2014's The Babadook, 2020's Relic, and the incredible Talk to Me and Bring Her Back from the Filippo brothers, which were released in 2022 and 2025 respectively. However, for many years this wasn't the case, as the first proper Australian horror talking picture wasn't released until 1973. This is a relatively late start when compared with the US and Europe, even when compared with the horror output from Spain, which, as we know, was delayed by the strict censorship imposed by the Franco regime. And strangely enough, despite lacking a nationalist dictatorship, a similar reason lay behind Australia's rather late entry into genre cinema. Because for 20 years, from 1948 to 1968, horror cinema was banned altogether. The first true Australian feature film was released in 1906 and was a biographical crime drama called The Story of the Kelly Gang, which, at a runtime of 70 minutes, is now widely regarded as the first full-length narrative feature film. Following the infamous Ned Kelly and his gang, it was an enormous success, recouping its budget from the first 3 screenings alone, and setting the stage for a series of films that are classified as bushranger films. We can loosely describe these as Australian westerns, largely set during the 19th century and focusing on charismatic outlaws or noble bandits. The success of the story of the Kelly Gang in the cities led to its being toured across Australia, establishing cinema as a lucrative commercial enterprise in the country and leading to a surge in localised filmmaking. From here on in, Australia began its first golden age of cinema, with 84 narrative films made between 1910 and 1912 alone. But not everyone was happy with the film's success, and many groups, including governing bodies and the police, saw it as glorifying criminal behaviour, leading to immediate bans in parts of the country. In fact, the outcry against this film, and others of its kind, was so intense that in 1912, bushranger films were banned altogether across both New South Wales and Victoria, setting the tone for what would happen later. In addition to bushranger films, which occasionally and very progressively depicted female protagonists, other popular genres included the prison or convict movie, like 1908's For the Term of His Natural Life, and mining dramas like 1907's Eureka Stockade. After the outbreak of World War I, Australian cinema pivoted to propaganda stories, and then after the war, these were quickly replaced by comedies and escapist narratives designed to take people's minds away from the aftermath of the conflict. The first silent Australian horror arrived, depending on how you interpret horror, either in 1912 with The Strangler's Grip or in 1919 with The Face at the Window. If not a horror, The Strangler's Grip was certainly the first Australian thriller, though, as it is now considered a lost film, there is very little information around its narrative. What we can say is that it was centred around a kidnap plot and that it was advertised as featuring a furious motor ride in the night, and by all accounts, it was incredibly popular. The Face at the Window, though, released in 1919, seems a more likely candidate for the first Australian horror film, and it was also the first ever adaptation of a popular stage play that would go on to be filmed internationally several times. Set not in Australia but in Paris, this told the story of a master criminal and a serial killer, and like its predecessor, was incredibly popular and is also, sadly, considered a lost movie. This was followed in 1924 with a film called Fisher's Ghost, in which the spirit of a murdered man leads a settler to find his body and bring his killer to justice. But sadly, just as the horror genre seemed to slowly be taking off, a decline in the Australian film industry due to financing problems, and also, importantly, the long arm of the censor saw it all come to an end. In 1917, the Commonwealth Film Censorship Board was established with the remit to view, register and censor all films, including those imported from overseas. Films could be refused registration for many reasons, including blasphemy, obscenity, their likelihood to incite audiences to crime, or if they, quote, depicted any matter the exhibition of which is undesirable in the public interest, end quote. And if that's not a catch-all sentence, then I don't really know what is. Film classification was also introduced, though, much like in the UK, these were advisory certificates rather than being upheld by law. Nevertheless, cinemas were required to include adults only on their advertising, and if they didn't, they and the distributor would receive a severe reprimand. The Universal horror franchise, launched at the beginning of the 1930s, posed a significant issue, causing multiple complaints to be submitted to the censors from church groups and concerned citizens, who no doubt implored the board to please think of the children. Much as in the UK, Frankenstein, released in 1931, caused a particular outcry, and by 1935 the chief censor noted that, despite drawing big crowds, the horror film was causing a significant number of complaints. By 1948, these censors had had enough of the horrors being imported from the US and made the bold move of banning horror films altogether. A statement released by the chief censor of the time, a man called J.O. Alexander, declared the following, quote, "For some considerable time past, consideration has been given to the doubtful value of horror stories on the entertainment screen. This type of film has no cultural or entertainment value, and its appeal extends only to a very limited section of the community, a section whose mental outlook should not be fed with films of this nature. In addition, such films are a source of potential danger to women in a delicate state of health. During the past 2 years, the chief censor has personally canvassed opinions in 4 states of the Commonwealth, not only those of widely varied cross-sections of the picture-going public, but also opinions of film distributors and exhibitors, press film critics, and interested government officials, and in no instance was the horror-type film defended. It has accordingly been decided, as a matter of censorship policy, that any film which would normally be classified as horror will in future be refused registration, subject, of course, to the existing right of appeal against the decision of the censorship board. End quote. This was reported on in the April 29th issue of the publication Film Weekly, under a headline titled, "Exit the Ghouls." To be fair, though, they did appear less concerned by the damage that the horror film could inflict on women of a delicate state of health or those of a certain mental outlook, writing, quote, "As the result of a decision announced last week by Chief Commonwealth Film Censor Mr. J.O. Alexander, the screen will be rid of any future Batmen, Leopard Men, Tiger Women, Catwomen, Frankenstein, and Dracula. From here on, no film will be registered by the censor where any of the cast sucks blood, turns into a wolf, or lies in a coffin with a stake through its heart. It is, of course, rather doubtful whether any of these quaint characteristics ever had a deleterious effect on the young, but they certainly did not do any good, and by being in the main poorly made, they served mainly to lower program standards." End quote. I'm sure we could spend quite a few hours picking that particular paragraph apart, not least its assertions that works from the likes of James Whale and Val Lewton were poorly made, but the evidence is clear. Australia, or at the very least the Australian film industry, had more than enough of horror. Although the ban would not be lifted until 1968, a few films did manage to slip through, most notably Hitchcock's Psycho in 1960 and Roger Corman's Tales of Terror in 1964. This seems to have been largely due to shifting audience expectations and also to a not insignificant amount of film snobbery. Film critic Colin Bennett noted at the time, quote, "Now that reputable artists like Hitchcock are returning to the genre with commercially important films, the censor is easing up on the ban." End quote. Then in 1968, a landmark case, Crowe versus Graham, was presented to the High Court, arguing against the interpretation of the words obscene and indecent. This set the path for a far more lenient community standards test, and the ban on horror was finally lifted. This was followed by further reforms announced in 1970, which saw the Australian approach shift from a closed and interventionist model of censorship into a much more open and liberal regime, based around classification being the norm and the banning of films as the exception. This was passed into law in 1972, and in the same year the first colour and talking picture Australian horror film finally arrived. Although there is an argument that 1971's Wake in Fright is horror adjacent, the first proper Australian horror of the decade is Night of Fear. This is a 50-minute exploitation film from a director and writer called Terry Borg, and it was originally made as a TV pilot before it received a theatrical release. As of the time of recording, it's available to watch on Shudder in the UK and also for rental from YouTube, and it's a surprisingly nasty piece of work. Much as in Spain then, it would appear that censorship did little to quell people's more bloodthirsty nature, other than to suppress it until such time as it could be expressed. This is the story of a character known only in the credits as the Girl, being pursued relentlessly by a killer known only in the credits as the Man, with other characters listed only as the Girl Rider, the Lover, the Truckie, and the Garage Attendant. It also has no dialogue, and is therefore a film that is less about characters and more purely about situation. It will probably come as no surprise, given the country's history with such materials, that it was banned on its original release. However, the ban was overturned on appeal, giving the marketing department a ready-made promotional campaign, with posters declaring it, quote, the film they didn't want you to see, end quote. It saw reasonable success at independent cinemas and drive-ins, and also marked the cinematic debut of actress Briony Behets, who stars as Marcia in the second of this week's films, Long Weekend. It's not a great movie, in my opinion, though interestingly, given it was released earlier, it has many similarities, tonally and stylistically, to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and also anticipates Greg McLean's ultra-nasty Wolf Creek, which would be released 3 decades later. In 1974, at the Sydney Film Festival, director Peter Weir gave audiences The Cars That Ate Paris, which was released in the US under the title The Cars That Eat People. Weir would go on to direct Picnic at Hanging Rock in 1975, The Last Wave in 1977, and then Hollywood heavy hitters like 1985's Witness and 1998's The Truman Show. This film marks his feature debut, and it's a pitch-black comedy horror about a town which profiteers by engineering the car accidents of passing visitors. It's possibly best known for the spiked car used in marketing publicity in video stores in the 1980s, and was also the inspiration for Roger Corman's Death Race 2000, released a year later in 1975. And although it struggled to find distribution in Australia on its release, it's gone on to, of course, become something of a cult classic. Also in 1974, Inn of the Damned, set in an 1896 mining community, gave us the first Australian horror western, the story of innkeepers murdering their guests, which was written and directed by Terry Bork, the same man who gave us Night of Fear. 2 years later, Endplay, from writer-director Tim Burstall, blended a serial killer narrative with a whodunit, and despite mixed reviews, won Best Editing at the Australian Film Institute Awards, while also scoring nominations for director Tim Burstall and lead actor George Malaby. 1975 saw the return of Peter Weir with Picnic at Hanging Rock, not really a horror, or at least not in the conventional sense, but he followed this with his apocalyptic and expressionist thriller The Last Wave, released in 1977. This features Richard Chamberlain as a lawyer who takes on a murder case and discovers he may have a spiritual connection to the indigenous people accused of the crime. Now considered one of the masterworks of what is termed the Australian New Wave, it was received positively by critics and was nominated for several Australian Film Awards, including Best Direction, Best Original Screenplay, Best Actor, Best Cinematography, and Best Sound. Of the nominations, it won the last 2, and while not as popular, either commercially or critically, as Picnic at Hanging Rock, it still grossed over $1.3 million at the Australian box office. As we can see then, unlike Spain, the relaxation of censorship laws didn't exactly create a deluge of horror, but what we can see is the gradual development of a movement that would, in 1978, give us Long Weekend. And this was the debut screenplay from a man who would go on to pen some of the most significant Australian horrors of the 1970s and 1980s, a writer called Everett De Roche. Everett De Roche was born not in Australia, but in the States in Lincoln, Maine, which he later described as being a tiny town of lakes and forests, and not far from Stephen King, going on to say, quote, "I think there's an inherent spookiness about Maine that spurs an interest in the dark side," end quote. When he was just 10 years old, he was taken out of school with a suspected heart murmur and spent much time at home with a private tutor, who introduced him to reading through the works of Robert Louis Stevenson, Mark Twain, and importantly, Edgar Allan Poe. He has said that this experience opened up a whole new world of imagination to him, saying, quote, "Poe with his floridly macabre impressionism, Twain with his humour and mastery of misery, and Stevenson with his swift storytelling, I thought, hey, I can do that." End quote. Later, he returned to school, where he found he could get attention and make people laugh by, as he put it, just writing words on paper. Describing this as the kind of attention that was usually only reserved for the school's football stars, he says that he never stopped writing from that point forward. In 1968, aged 22, he moved to Australia, partly motivated by the surfing culture and also partly by the American political climate of the late 1960s, including, of course, the draft for the Vietnam War. Arriving ahead of his wife on an ocean liner and carrying a surfboard, he bought a car and headed north, where he began a career in journalism, editing a suburban weekly newspaper, and then later working for the Queensland Health Education Council, where he wrote public health material as well as a column for the Brisbane Telegraph. He moved into script writing through television and a company called Crawford Productions, who were based in Melbourne and who, he heard, paid for scripts. Borrowing a typewriter from work, he wrote a speculative teleplay for a police series called Division 4. 9 months later, Crawford Productions sent him a telegram inviting him to Melbourne to try out as a scriptwriter. This trial grew into a contract and he began writing for Australian TV dramas, largely police procedurals, including Division 4, Homicide, Ryan and Matlock Police. With no formal training in screenwriting, he described the environment as being one of earn while you learn, with the fast turnover required teaching him both speed and structure. He worked as a staff writer at Crawford Productions between 1970 and 1974, and then began freelancing before establishing himself as one of the leading screenwriters of thrillers in Australia. His work has been called instrumental in leading the movement of Australian exploitation cinema, and as well as Long Weekend, his work includes Patrick, released in 1978, Harlequin, released in 1980, Road Games, released in 1981, and Razorback from 1984. And now it's time for us to get into the spoilers, so, as always, if you have yet to see Long Weekend, please tread very carefully from here on in. Long Weekend was De Roche's first feature screenplay, and it was inspired by an Easter holiday with his family at an isolated beach in New South Wales. Becoming lost on the tracks at night as they tried to find the beach itself, he began to wonder what it would be like to keep passing the same spot over and over, something that of course happens to our protagonists Peter and Marcia. Ironically enough, when they came to actually filming Long Weekend several years later, by coincidence the crew chose the exact same beach, something that he later described as being extraordinary. Quote, "This was a beach that was quite hard to get to. I'm not sure it was even on the map. And several years later, when it came to making the movie, without my input at all, they chose exactly the same beach. Of all the beaches in Australia and the beaches that are much closer to Melbourne, which would have been far more practical, they chose exactly the same spot." End quote. De Roche began developing his screenplay from this very basic idea, something that he did with no outline, no notes, and no research, and very little idea as to where the story was going, saying that he simply started at page 1, scene 1, and then made it up as he went along. Completing it in 10 days, he showed it to a colleague at Crawford's, a director called Colin Eggleston, who decided it would make a good feature. Working with a producer called Richard Brennan, they secured finance from the Australian Film Commission and Film Victoria to the amount of 270,000 Australian dollars, the equivalent of around about 2 million Australian dollars today, which for listeners not in Australia equates roughly to 1.4 million US dollars and just over $1 million British pounds. Hello to my listeners in Australia, by the way. Shot on location in New South Wales over 27 days, Long Weekend tells the story of Peter and Marcia, city dwellers experiencing marital difficulties who decide to spend a holiday weekend camping in the countryside. To be fair though, this is far more Peter's idea than it is Marcia's, who would much rather be spending their money and their time in a luxury hotel, specifically the VIP suite at the Southern Cross. That they are experiencing relationship issues is made clear from the very start, with Marcia complaining on the telephone that Peter is behaving like quote-unquote a little shit at the moment, a dynamic that is reinforced when Peter arrives home from the city with a newly purchased rifle and immediately takes aim at Marcia to view her through the sight. This immediately sets up the idea that Peter is planning to kill his wife, but though this is accidentally the final outcome, This is not the direction that the film eventually takes us in, one of the first examples of misdirection that De Roche inserts into his screenplay. Because although the script does initially set us up in this direction, it is not each other who pose the threat to their physical safety, though there is certainly enough tension to suggest otherwise. Nor is it the threat from the bar patrons they encounter on their journey, another example of misdirection which, for a moment at least, suggests that we are in for a backwards horror in the style of Deliverance. Instead, the threat they encounter, psychologically and physically, comes from the environment, with nature itself acting as a third character in the film, as the wildlife, even the plants, exact revenge on the couple for their careless and self-centered behavior. According to De Roche, quote, "Nature is supposed to be the hero of the piece. The two characters, Peter and Marcia, are pretty unsympathetic. They invade the bush, and the bush deals with them." End quote. As the tagline on the poster puts it, their crime was against nature, and nature found them guilty. That being said, though, De Roche was also quick to point out that Long Weekend is not supposed to be a preachy environmental statement, calling it instead a very condensed way of saying that nature is quite capable of looking after itself if man gets too out of line. There are portents of this throughout the first third of the movie, even before the couple leave for their destination. Following a long opening shot of a spider crab climbing a rock face, the movie cuts to John leaving the city, bidding farewell to a mysterious woman and disrupting a flock of birds with his car engine. This is followed by a sequence of Peter stuck in traffic, which is reminiscent of the opening of 1974's The Living Dead at Manchester Morgue, and then the camera abruptly cuts to the close-up of a fern, which we soon discover is a house plant being watered in the bath as Marcia prepares for their weekend getaway. Here, nature is being fettered and domesticated, a state of affairs that, in the final and circular shot of the movie, is shown to be only temporary. As Marcia walks through the house, in a scene which proves that 1970s interior design was indeed brown and orange, a news report in the background tells of a flock of cockatoos attacking houses in Sydney and causing extensive damage, something which subtly hints at the apocalyptic scenario posited by Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. Peter arrives home, crashing his sports car into the back of their Jeep, suggesting a history of careless driving that is later underlined by Marcia's attitude towards him when they are finally on the open road, cautioning him not to overtake a van in front of them. And she clearly has good reason to be wary. When she eventually falls asleep on the journey, Peter is momentarily distracted and runs into a kangaroo, another portent of trouble ahead, while also demonstrating the couple's rather careless attitude towards their surroundings. They are, indeed, a truly unpleasant couple, both to each other and their environment, arguing incessantly, starting fires with discarded cigarettes, and running over wildlife. And this is before we even get to the more deliberate examples of environmental damage they inflict once they reach their destination. As writer De Roche later said, quote, "The idea was that as an audience you turn to nature's side. You want nature to stamp these people out. They were quite intentionally non-sympathetic, which is something that wasn't done very often in those days." End quote. Their self-centered attitude, or at least Marcia's, is even directed towards Peter's dog, Cricket, as she plans to leave her abandoned at home for 3 days, with only a bowl of dog food for sustenance while they are away. That Marcia fails to understand that a dog cannot exercise portion control is testimony to her willful ignorance of the animal kingdom, and is behaviour that is sure to enrage even the most casual of animal lovers, and pretty much marks her for death within the first 10 minutes. As they head to their destination, we are witness to no small amount of tension between the two. Though the original screenplay contained a prologue which explained the reason for their marital discord, this was cut out altogether, and we are left to surmise the reason for their problems as the narrative progresses. As it does, we infer that they have been playing at swinging, very 1970s, with their neighbours, Mark and Frida, something which Peter seems to have initiated because of an attraction to the female of the couple, though, as it turns out, it was Mark and Marcia who became a little bit too close. As a result, Marcia fell pregnant, and opted for a secret termination, a decision that has turned the obvious cracks in their relationship into an ever-widening chasm. Peter is played by John Hargreaves, who began a career in teaching before switching over to acting, and who would go on to have a successful career in Australian film and television. He was a central male performer in the Australian New Wave, though he sadly never achieved the breakout international success that he truly deserved. He was born in 1945 in Kogarah, a suburb of Sydney. I really hope I pronounced that properly. And after graduating from a boys' school in the area, won a scholarship to a teachers' college, gaining his first teaching position at the age of only 19. While posted to a school in New South Wales, he attended a touring stage production of Wuthering Heights, something which inspired an interest in acting, which was exacerbated a year later when he caught another touring production, this time of the kitchen sink drama A Taste of Honey. In 1968, he was transferred from the countryside to a school in Sydney and joined the New Theatre, where he appeared in several stage productions. But though the directors at the theatre noted his energy and stage presence, they suggested that he not bother going any further with stage school. Thankfully, this was advice that Hargreaves ignored, and he auditioned for the National Institute of Dramatic Art, or NIDA, from which he graduated in 1970. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. As we've discussed, Australian cinema and also television were having something of a revival, and he soon found himself appearing in guest roles in various TV shows, including Division 4, which, as we've heard, was also where Everett De Roche was working as a writer. His first film role came in 1975 with The Removalists, a violent drama centering on two policemen who receive a domestic violence complaint and initially assist the victim in moving out of her home before things take a decidedly darker turn. Based on a stage play of the same name, Hargreaves played one of the principal characters, the younger of the two policemen, who is having a very bad first day on the job. This film would serve as his breakout role, leading to further films, including the lead in Don's Party, a black comedy that proved to be highly controversial, and Mad Dog Morgan, a bushranger film starring Dennis Hopper, both of which were released in 1976. His casting in Long Weekend came at the recommendation of the producer, Richard Brennan, with whom he had worked on The Removalists and Mad Dog Morgan, and it has to be said, this is a brilliant decision. Hargreaves once described acting as being like a good liar, in that you truly have to believe in what you are saying and what you are doing, and this is certainly true of him here, as he delivers a convincing and seemingly effortless performance as a boorish and immature husband who pushed his wife into swinging and who is now unable to live with the repercussions. He is also incredibly destructive, setting a fire with a discarded cigarette, chopping at a tree for no other reason than it happens to be there, and firing off his rifle in a demonstration of machismo that leads to the death of a mother duck. It's also his fault that they end up lost in the first place. It's not only his idea to go camping, but he also ignores the many, many red flags along the way that would tell any normal person to turn back. The first of these is, of course, the death of the kangaroo, which is run over not once but twice, first by Peter and then by the van that he is overtaken once Marcia is asleep, an act that demonstrates a willfulness and stubbornness that will become his calling card for the rest of the film. This scene also gives the first demonstration of the movie's impressive and nightmarish sound design, with the screaming of the kangaroo, or possibly the wail of another creature in the darkness, recalling a quote from the painter Edvard Munch about an infinite scream that he once heard passing through nature. While Marcia remains sleeping in the jeep, Peter stops at a bar to buy provisions, and it is here that we meet the patrons who initially serve as Deliverance-style red herrings. At this point, we learn that Peter has decided that the perfect spot for their getaway is a beach just down the road from an abattoir, but also that the locals have no idea where it is, and indeed seem never to have heard of it. Initially, at least, our Deliverance detectives suggest that the locals might be lying, something that seems reinforced by the menacing way they stare at the couple as they drive off to the darkness, leading to an elegant transition from the eyes of the young trucker watching them leave to the headlights of the jeep as they reach their turning off the main road. Not that the locals' ignorance of their destination serves as any problem for Peter. He outright lies to Marcia when returning to the Jeep, telling her that their destination is just down the road. He's even less bothered by the keep out sign that initially blocks their progress, ignoring it altogether without realizing that this is possibly his last opportunity to turn back and head to civilization. By the time they start driving through the bushland, one half expects Rod Serling to announce that they have now entered the Twilight Zone, and this is something that would certainly be suitable for a film in which direction and even time seem to have no meaning other than to serve as a terrible trap. As the Jeep winds its way through seemingly endless woodland, we are treated to discordant notes from Michael Carlos's excellent, jarring and abstract soundtrack, as well as the always menacing framing of a windshield filled with darkness, the headlights barely penetrating the undergrowth and the overgrowth that lies ahead. We talked about this effect when we covered the films Dead End and In the Mouth of Madness in earlier episodes, and it never fails to be disturbing, creating anticipation or dread in the viewer that at any moment something horrifying might spring suddenly into view. This, however, would have been far too blatant, and what we have instead is a journey along a Mobius strip of beach path, as Peter drives continually past the same arrow carved into a tree, and Marcia becomes increasingly frustrated with his men don't need maps approach to navigation. And being fair, one can hardly blame her. This hardly seems to be the ideal place for a getaway, with disquieting noises emerging from the bushland and even Cricket the dog whining in sympathy. But whatever empathy we might have felt for her is quickly eliminated, as Peter, seemingly still shaken from his earlier accident and drenched from a sudden thunderstorm, confesses that while she was asleep, he hit a kangaroo. Although she gives no response, her body language blatantly indicates that, quite frankly, she couldn't give a fuck. Now, she tells him the next morning she's really not the outdoors type. You're not kidding. Marcia is played by Briony Behets, a British-born actress who initially studied at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama in London before moving to Australia in 1971, aged 19. Soon after arriving, she appeared in a short-lived comedy series called Birds in the Bush, and then moved on to a soap opera called Number 96, in which she appeared in 27 episodes. After this, as we've heard, she appeared as an early victim, known only as Horse Girl, in the horror movie Night of Fear. And she followed this with guest roles in multiple TV shows, including The Evil Touch, Matlock Police and Homicide, before securing longer-running roles in the soap operas The Box and The Class of 74. Around this time, she began dating and then married Colin Eggleston, the director of Long Weekend, though she was not his first choice for the role of Marcia, partly from fear of perceived nepotism and partly because his first choice was another actress altogether. However, much like with John Hargreaves, she was suggested by producer Richard Brennan, who had worked with her earlier on a 1976 movie called The Trespassers. Apart from the opportunity to appear in another feature film, Behets was drawn to the project because, as she put it, the film not only explored relationships, but also explored relationships within the confines of the outdoors. Having lived on a farm, she says that she had observed firsthand people moving from the city to the country without understanding nature and the subsequent destruction that they caused as a result. For her, it was the perfect opportunity to reflect this experience and also to put it into context. Despite the intensity of both she and Hargreaves' performances and the toxicity of Peter and Marcia's relationship, she has described filming as being full of laughter and joking, something that she attributed to the general atmosphere on set, as well as to the fact that Hargreaves was, quote, outrageously funny, outrageously gay, and irreverent, end quote. And although they had minimal rehearsal, the dynamic between the two characters is incredibly well played and also fascinating, as they oscillate between moments of attempted intimacy and outright disdain. Even the seemingly small gesture of her silently lighting a cigarette for him as he drives suggests a shared connection, though all of these moments are very fleeting and quickly punctured by animosity. Two such examples occur the next morning when Marcia wakes to find that Peter has set up camp just a few yards away from where they have spent the night sleeping in the Jeep. This leads to a very brief flirtation when he asks for praise for his efforts and she responds by calling him a good boy, and this is then built on further as the two fall down a sand dune laughing, rolling towards the sea. Of course it doesn't last, but at the very least it is a brief respite from their endless bickering, showing a softness to the characters that might have made us more empathetic had they not been such truly wretched people. We can see that they were probably once a pair who did indeed care for each other, and that elements of this remain buried somewhere, though, as I say, the moments are very fleeting and quickly punctured by insults and animosity. And even the choice of their insults is illuminating, as they resort to terms like pig, rat, tortoise, and tomcat as pejoratives, showing their contempt for the natural world as well as for each other. Their arrival at their destination allows director Eggleston and cinematographer Vincent Morton to fully illustrate the beauty of the Australian landscape, something that we have glimpsed briefly before the opening credits and which is captured here in widescreen Panavision. This was certainly rare for a low-budget movie, as it was felt by the backers that it would harm its eventual transfer onto television. But it was fought for greatly by Morton and Brennan, and it's very good that they did, as the cinematography allows them to capture the expansive landscape in which our two intruders seem increasingly marooned and insignificant. This choice is something that Brennan credits as giving the film its longevity, making a micro-budget movie seem far more expensive and giving it a scale that would not have been achieved using more conventional filming techniques. Another innovation was the use of Steadicam, allowing the camera to follow John as he runs through the undergrowth later in the movie, while also providing similar subjective shots to those we see in Halloween, which was filmed using similar camera techniques at around the same time in the States. Here, though, the subjective viewpoint is not that of a mad killer, but of nature itself, with the camera ducking down behind bushes and at one point giving a literal bird's eye view of the couple from the trees. But even surrounded by the beauty of the shoreline, the two cannot help but wallow in wanton acts of destruction. When Marcia first awakes at the campsite, Peter is chopping at a tree, and when she asks for his reason, his response is simply, "Why not?" Soon after, Marcia attacks the resident ants with insecticide, and Peter throws his empty beer bottles into the ocean. Though it has to be said that these are of little significance compared with the acts of slaughter he commits carelessly with the previously mentioned killing of the mother duck, and deliberately when he shoots at a dark shape in the water. This turns out to not be a shark, as first suspected, but instead a dugong or a sea cow, a harmless animal whose death leaves the lapping waves frothing red with blood. Soon after, the animal washes up onto the shoreline, and in a series of creepy moments, the body seems to edge its way closer to the camp when no one is looking, something which the writer Kim Newman has described as coming straight from the pages of the writer M.R. James. Marcia also finds an eagle egg in the sand and thoughtlessly carries it around before bringing it back to camp, leading to an attack on Peter as the bird tries to reclaim its unborn young. This prompts Marcia to throw the egg and smash it against a nearby tree, revealing it to have been fully fertilized, as blood and dark matter slowly slide down the tree trunk. This is clearly designed to be analogous with Marcia's decision to terminate her pregnancy, and being honest is the one problematic aspect of the film, equating her decision with her hatred of nature and leading to a clumsy exchange between she and Peter that could have been left as subtext rather than being said aloud. Other examples include the dugong itself, which we learn was female and probably has a pup in the ocean, giving an explanation for the wailing sound that keeps them up at night. Like I say, it all feels a bit clumsy and also incredibly judgmental. As Marcia herself says later, "Spare me the grotty symbolism." The haunting cries of the dugong's abandoned pup, a rapidly defrosting chicken which decays overnight, and a malfunctioning spear gun, which misfires dangerously close to Marcia, suggests that the land is not so much retaliating as it is haunted. We soon discover that Peter and Marcia are not its only victims. A discarded doll on the shoreline, covered in lichen, seems incredibly ominous, especially given its missing limbs. All signs point to this being the final remnant of other visitors to the area, most likely people from the camper van that Peter spots parked some distance down the shore. After being attacked by the eagle, and then unusually by a possum, Peter, who has so far been obstinately determined to stay as long as possible, finally concedes to Marcia's request to leave early, but not before they drive along the coastline to pay a visit to their as-yet unseen neighbours. As they drive along the coast, Peter sings the opening refrain of the Teddy Bear's Picnic. If you go down to the woods today, you're sure of a big surprise. Meanwhile, the radio tells of atomic testing in China, yet more evidence of man's inability to live harmoniously with the planet, and which of course acts as a recall to the first of this week's movies. On arriving at their destination, they see that the camper, once parked on the shoreline, is now being reclaimed by the ocean, suggesting that despite our belief in our own superiority, nature will eventually reclaim us all. This is taken a step further when Peter discovers an abandoned campsite, strangely and seemingly suddenly overgrown by flora, and he also finds an abandoned dog, which, despite his best efforts to retrieve it, bares its teeth menacingly, in a sign that it, like the landscape, has turned feral. Returning to the Jeep, he is just in time to stop Marcia from drowning herself in the ocean, a callback to an earlier conversation where she asks him what he would have done had she actually died. We can therefore infer that this is possibly the second such attempt at suicide, but it could also be that the siren call of nature has attempted to lure her to her death. After all, as we soon discover, the occupants of the camper van have also met a watery grave, with at least one body submerged beneath the water as Peter swims out to peer into the back seat. Returning to their campsite, Marcia takes the Jeep and leaves Peter behind, though, much as with their arrival, the bushland pathways have other ideas, and she begins to drive in circles. We even hear the sound of the engine close by as Peter sits mournfully alone by the fire. Backlit by red taillights and menaced by the shrieks of nature from the undergrowth, Marcia eventually crashes and then abandons the Jeep, continuing her journey on foot, a decision that, unfortunately for her, takes her back towards her husband. Meanwhile, Peter, alone in the dark save for his dog Cricket, becomes increasingly spooked by his surroundings, the sound design once again coming to the fore as the screams and shrieks of wildlife grow with intensity. The tree that he had earlier attacked with a hatchet also joins in, shedding a heavy branch dangerously close by, and terrified at his predicament, he begins shooting into the darkness, first with his rifle and then with his spear gun. And this is rather unfortunate for Marcia, as returning to the camp, she takes the spear directly to the throat, but this is not revealed until the next morning. In a magnificently underplayed tracking shot, we first see Peter and then a trail of their discarded litter, before the camera settles on Marcia's body lying dead amongst the grass. Once again, we have a moment of tenderness. This is, of course, far too late, as Peter covers her body with a blanket, before finding the Jeep and driving off to what he hopes will be freedom. Once again, though, nature has other ideas, and the Jeep soon becomes stuck in mud, leading to a moment which effectively seals his fate if he hadn't done so already. Despite earlier interactions with his dog Cricket, in which he implores, "You wouldn't leave me, would you, girl?" he does exactly that to her, leaving her shut in the Jeep as he runs off into the bushland. And so, being blunt, he absolutely deserves what happens next. Finally finding the highway, he stands, rather unwisely as it turns out, in the middle of the road to hail an approaching truck. At the last moment, a bird flies into the cabin and distracts the driver, and Peter is effectively flattened on the tarmac, echoing the fate of the kangaroo he hit on the way out there. And given what he did to the kangaroo, the dugong, the tree, the mother duck, to Cricket, and even to Marcia, quite frankly, serves him right. But although the film always ended with Peter's messy demise, the original version of the screenplay had a slightly different build-up, with him being pursued through the shrubland until he found himself surrounded by the animals. As described by writer De Roche, this was to have acted as a last-ditch attempt to show Peter the error of his ways, but was cut due to budgetary restraints and the need to wrangle multiple animals. From De Roche's description, though, this cutting might not have been a bad thing. Quote, "In the final siege, where they're chasing him through the forest, they actually surround him at one stage, as if giving him a chance. The night before, they had observed him singing in his tent, getting stoned and playing the guitar, and he was at peace. So in the finale, they drag a guitar and lay that at his feet to give him a chance to redeem himself. I think he might have picked up the guitar and then smashed an animal or something. And that was it. The final curtain for him." End quote. Like I say, probably not a bad thing. It was cut. With Peter lying dead on the road, the trucker jumps from his van to see what has happened, and we see that it is in fact the young man we saw earlier in the bar, who had watched Peter and Marcia drive off into the darkness. It's a nice moment of circularity, and one that is built on as we note that his truck is filled with livestock, presumably headed to the abattoir just along the road from the beach. Is this a last example of man's inhumanity to the animal kingdom, or is it a rather ironic sick joke that Peter gets killed by a truck full of cattle? I'll let you be the judge. The final shot of the movie circles back to an earlier scene in the film, a fern growing around the spear that has impaled Marcia, referencing the plants that she watered in her bathroom. Once we are gone, the film seems to be saying, nature will continue on, and what we once tried to confine will dominate, and the world will continue to turn. Long Weekend premiered at the Sitges International Film Festival in October 1978, where it was very well received. It also won John Hargreaves the Best Actor at the same event, beating Donald Pleasance for Halloween, Klaus Kinski for Nosferatu, and Laurence Olivier for Dracula. It also did incredibly well at the Avoriaz Fantastic Film Festival, where it tied with Philip Kaufman's Invasion of the Body Snatchers to win the Antenne 2 award, and was also very well received at the Cannes Film Festival, where it was purchased by 4 international distributors, making it the most commercially successful Australian film screened at the festival that year. Sadly though, it did not do well at home in Australia, where it wouldn't be released until March 1979. Critical response was mixed to negative, and it was a commercial disappointment. There has been much speculation as to why it did so much better overseas than at home, with some suggesting that the central characters were far too unpleasant for Australian audiences to relate to. Others have suggested that the attacks by the wildlife, which were deliberately staged to be carried out by animals that are usually harmless, like a possum and a regionally incorrect at the time Tasmanian devil, required far too much of a suspension of disbelief. Outside of Australia, of course, most people think that pretty much any animal in the country is going to kill you, so this may explain why it was embraced without such comment elsewhere. Everett De Roche, though, had a rather different opinion, saying that, quote, "Unfortunately, the bush comes across as a threat too early. It should have emerged as a threat only after the audience has sympathised with the animals. And I don't think that sympathy is there. Long Weekend would have been much better if the audience had been told at the beginning that Peter and Marcia were going to die. That way, they wouldn't have to sympathise with them and could have concerned themselves wholly with when this is going to happen. Such is the essence of suspense." End quote. Personally, I'm not sure I agree with that, as I think Peter and Marcia are marked for doom pretty much from the beginning, and they certainly don't elicit any sympathy from me. But then again, I saw the film after I knew the central conceit, so one could say that I'd already been forewarned. In any case, though, the film is certainly far better than the 2008 remake, which was filmed from a revamped screenplay by Everett De Roche and was directed by Jamie Blanks, the Australian director behind 1998's Urban Legend and 2001's Valentine. I watched it relatively recently as preparation for this week's episode and really wished I hadn't bothered, and so I would probably advise you to give it a wide berth. As mentioned, Everett De Roche would go on to write many of the films that made up Australian horror in the 70s and 80s, and he continued writing screenplays into the early 2000s. His final screenplays were for the remake of Long Weekend in 2008, and then a year later, the horror movie 9 Miles Down. He died in 2014 from cancer and is survived by his wife, 6 daughters, and several grandchildren. Briony Behets has had an incredibly long and successful career in film and television, with roles in the UK, the US, and of course Australia, including Murder, She Wrote, Families, Prisoner Cell Block H, A Country Practice, The Flying Doctors, and Neighbours, in which she last appeared in 2025. John Hargreaves went on to be considered one of Australia's great actors, and worked in both film and TV, though, as I mentioned earlier, he never saw the international success that he undoubtedly deserved. He did, however, win multiple awards for acting over the course of his career, going on to be awarded the Australian Film Institute's Byron Kennedy Award for Excellence in the Film Industry in 1994. He died just 2 years later, in 1996, from complications from AIDS, after contracting HIV in 1984. He was buried, at his request, with the Sitges Award he won for Long Weekend. At his funeral, fellow Australian actor Brian Brown captured Hargreaves' irreverent spirit while also paying tribute to his considerable talents, saying, quote, "Geez, they might as well shoot us now. How can we better that act?" End quote. The Day the Earth Caught Fire and Long Weekend are both ecological horrors that pit man against the environment. In one, the characters are sympathetic, and in the other, they are truly horrendous. But in both films, man is very much the architect of his own demise, either through attempts at world superiority or through sheer bloody-mindedness and ignorance concerning his surroundings. Together, they remind us that despite our hubris and supposed superiority, we are in fact only visitors on this planet, and that once we overstep our boundaries, Mother Nature and the elements will redress the balance, particularly once we have clearly outstayed our welcome. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, so thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed the show, please remember to rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And please remember, you can always email the horrordouble@gmail.com and follow our Instagram account, the Horror Double Bill. Next week, we are exploring the horrors of greed and a few other cardinal sins as seen through the perspective of international folk horror. First up, we have Onibaba from Japan, which was released in 1964. This was directed by Kaneto Shindo and stars Nobuko Otawa, Chisuko Yoshimura, and Kei Sato. Then we follow this with our first film from India, which is Tumbad from 2018, and director Rehi Anilbave. This stars Soham Shah, Jyoti Malshe, and Mohammed Samad. If you'd like to watch along, you can find out where these films are streaming in your area by visiting justwatch.com. And if they're not available in your country and you have a VPN, you can also see when they might be playing in other regions. So I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and until then, thank you very much for listening, and have a really great week. Goodbye.